When the CEO of our firm looked me dead in the eye and called me just a secretary, I swallowed the insult, but inside I burned. I had spent years working late nights, making sure everything ran smoothly, cleaning up mistakes that nobody ever noticed. And yet in one sentence he reminded me how invisible I was to him. I knew something he didn't, something that could change everything. My name is Clara Jennings. I was 36 and had been working at Whitmore and Associates for nearly a decade. I wasn't the kind of person people noticed when they walked into a room. I wasn't flashy. I didn't have an MBA. But I knew every moving part of that company, the deals, the clients, the numbers, the schedules, because it was my job to know. My desk was always piled with files and notes, but it wasn't chaos to me. It was a system, and I understood it better than anyone. The man who thought otherwise was Lawrence Whitmore, the CEO. He wore expensive suits, gave long speeches at conferences, and always seemed to enjoy the sound of his own voice more than anything else. To most people, he came off as charming and confident, but to those who worked closest with him, he was arrogant and cruel. He believed titles were what made someone important, and since mine was executive secretary, I was nothing more than background noise to him. One evening, I was going through the proposal for a huge deal with Caldwell Industries. Lawrence was planning to sign it the next morning, but something in the numbers caught my eye. I had been typing and retyping those contracts for weeks, and I knew what should have been there. I stopped and read it again, my stomach tightening as I realized the error. It wasn't small. If the deal went forward the way it was written, our company stood to lose a fortune. I checked again, running through the calculations carefully. I wasn't imagining it. The mistake was real. My first thought was to bring it to Lawrence right away. He might have been difficult, but even he wouldn't want the company dragged into a disaster like this. I printed out my notes, highlighted the section, and walked into his office. He was sitting behind his desk, leaning back in his chair with a glass of whiskey in his hand. A few other managers were there, laughing at one of his jokes. I waited for a pause before I spoke, showing him the paper and explaining what I had found. For a moment, I thought he might actually listen. He glanced at the paper, then at me and smirked. "Clara," he said loudly enough for the whole room to hear, "you're just a secretary. Leave the numbers to the real professionals." The managers laughed with him, though a couple looked uncomfortable. I felt my face burn, but I didn't argue. I stood there, holding the paper, while he turned back to his drink as if I had wasted his time. He dismissed me with a wave of his hand. I walked out quietly, but inside I was shaking. It wasn't only the insult. It was the knowledge that he had just ignored the truth, and that truth was going to come back and tear him apart. He didn't know it yet, but the day he mocked me was the day he planted the seed of his own downfall. The office was quiet that night, the kind of silence that made every sound echo against the glass walls. Most of the building was empty, but I stayed behind because something about the Caldwell contract didn't sit right with me. I spread the papers out across my desk, highlighting numbers and comparing them to the drafts I'd kept in my files. The more I looked, the worse it became. There it was, an error buried inside a pricing clause, small enough to miss at first glance, but big enough to bleed us dry if the deal went through. I recalculated everything twice, then a third time, hoping I was wrong. But the figures lined up the same every time. It wasn't a typo or a misunderstanding. It was a serious mistake, and it could cost us millions. I sat back in my chair, staring at the numbers. For years I had been the one catching slips like this, the one who noticed when someone left out a decimal or misquoted a line. This wasn't new to me, but the scale of it was terrifying. A deal this size wasn't something you could cover up with a quick correction later. If it went forward, the consequences would follow us for years. By morning, I had my notes in order and went straight to Lawrence's office. He was already surrounded by a handful of senior managers, all dressed in dark suits, coffee in hand, laughing at some story he was telling. I waited at the edge of the room until he finally turned to me. I explained the problem clearly, laying out the contract and pointing to the exact spot where the numbers didn't add up. He glanced at the section I showed him, gave me a thin smile, and leaned back in his chair. "Clara," he said, "I've been in this business longer than you've been alive. I don't need a secretary second-guessing me on million-dollar contracts." A few of the managers chuckled at his words, and my throat tightened. I tried again, calmly pointing out the evidence I'd gathered. I wasn't emotional, just precise, because I believed if I laid it out simply, anyone could see the risk. Lawrence didn't even bother to look down at the page this time. He waved his hand as though brushing away a fly. I said drop it, he snapped. The deal is solid. Don't waste my time. I stood frozen as he turned back to the others, pouring himself another cup of coffee as though the conversation had never happened. They moved on to discussing the signing ceremony scheduled for that afternoon, how big the headlines would be once the Caldwell partnership was announced. I stayed quiet, holding my notes against my chest like they were meaningless scraps of paper. Later that day, I watched from the back of the room as Lawrence signed the contract in front of the team. Cameras flashed, and everyone applauded. He looked triumphant, soaking in the attention, while I felt smaller than ever. I knew what was coming, and I knew he had just laughed off the one chance he had to avoid it. In that moment, humiliation burned hotter than fear. I wasn't just ignored, I was dismissed in front of everyone, as though I had no value at all. It left me standing there powerless, with the weight of knowing the truth pressing down on me while he basked in his pride. It didn't take long for the mistake to show its teeth. Just 3 weeks after the contract was signed, Caldwell Industries sent over a letter that chilled everyone in the office. They had caught the pricing error, and they weren't happy. What should have been a partnership was now turning into a threat. They accused us of trying to trick them, and their lawyers were already circling. The figure they demanded in damages was staggering. The mood in the office changed overnight. Gone were the celebratory smiles and champagne toasts. People whispered in hallways, closed doors quickly when others passed, and avoided eye contact. Lawrence, who had strutted around with his usual arrogance, suddenly looked restless. Meetings dragged on for hours as the leadership team tried to figure out how to contain the fallout. Our reputation, the very thing clients trusted us for, was slipping away by the day. I kept my head down, but inside I was boiling. I had warned him. I had done everything I could to prevent this. Every time I walked past the conference room, I heard raised voices, arguments, and frantic phone calls. Then one morning, Lawrence called an emergency all-staff meeting. He stood in front of us, his face tight, his tone clipped. "We're in a difficult position," he said, pacing as though rehearsing for a performance. "Mistakes were made in reviewing the Caldwell contract, and it has put the firm at serious risk. But let me be clear, this wasn't a leadership mistake. It was a clerical one, something that should have been caught before it ever reached my desk." His eyes landed on me. The room turned, and suddenly all those faces, co-workers I'd eaten lunch with, greeted every morning, were staring at me like I had just betrayed them. My stomach dropped. He continued without hesitation. "It was the responsibility of my secretary to make sure every detail was flawless. That's what she's paid for. And somehow this got overlooked." I could barely breathe. The words felt like a blow to the chest. He was rewriting history right in front of everyone. He hadn't just dismissed me weeks ago. Now he was erasing his arrogance and planting the blame squarely on my shoulders. I wanted to speak, to shout, to show them the notes I'd kept and the warnings I had given. But the weight of the stares around me froze me in place. I felt trapped between humiliation and fury. After the meeting, whispers followed me down the hall. People avoided my eyes. A few gave me sympathetic looks, but no one dared to speak up. Lawrence had set the narrative, and I was the scapegoat. That night, sitting at my kitchen table with the stack of papers I had saved, I let the shock melt into something sharper. Rage. Not the kind that fades after a few days, but the kind that settles deep, waiting for the right moment. He thought he could crush me under his pride and protect himself. He thought I'd stay quiet, that I had no power. But he was wrong. He didn't know it yet, but he had just handed me the reason, and the fuel, for his downfall. I didn't explode. I didn't shout in that meeting, and I didn't try to defend myself in front of everyone. Lawrence expected me to. He wanted me flustered, emotional, scrambling for words so he could dismiss me again. Instead, I stayed quiet. I walked out of that room with my head down, but inside, I was already making a decision. I knew the truth, and I had proof. From the very beginning, I had kept copies of the emails I sent him, the draft of the contract with my notes in the margins, and the printed memo where I highlighted the error. I kept a copy of his calendar entry for the meeting where I had tried to warn him. Even the small details, the time stamps, the attachments, were in my files. He thought he had buried me under his authority, but he didn't realize I had been keeping the evidence that would bury him instead. Every night after work, I sat at my kitchen table with folders spread across the surface, organizing everything into order. I made sure nothing was left out. I wasn't rushing, because timing mattered more than anger. If I moved too fast, he would see me coming. I needed to wait until the damage was deep enough that the board and the clients were desperate for answers. Then, and only then, would my evidence matter. In the weeks that followed, I paid attention to the board members. They were sharp, calculating people, and they had already started to doubt Lawrence. I could see it in the way they pressed him harder during meetings, asking about financial risks he used to brush off with a smile. I noticed the looks they exchanged when he dodged questions. They weren't loyal to him. They were loyal to the firm, and their patience was wearing thin. I kept my head low, taking notes in silence, filing papers, acting like nothing was different. But every word he spoke, every excuse he gave, I tucked away in my memory. The more he lied, the more powerful the truth in my hands became. Sometimes, when I caught sight of him striding through the office, acting untouchable, my stomach twisted with the urge to confront him. But I forced myself to stay calm. He had underestimated me once, and I wasn't going to ruin my chance by being reckless. My revenge wouldn't be loud or messy. It would be precise, undeniable, and permanent. Late one evening, I closed the last folder and leaned back in my chair. Everything was in place, the emails, the memos, the timelines. I imagined the look on his face when it all came crashing down, when the people he counted on the most saw him for what he was. That thought carried me through the long days of pretending. He believed I was powerless, but in truth, I was holding the match that could set fire to everything he had built. All I had to do was wait for the right moment to strike. Lawrence started losing his calm. Meetings that had once felt like performances became frantic. He paced the glass-walled conference room, rubbing his temples, and barked orders like someone trying to erase a stain by shouting at it. The legal team wanted more documentation. The board wanted answers. Instead of admitting fault, he tried to bend the facts to fit his story. And that's when he turned to me. He called me into his office one afternoon, face flushed. "I need you to tidy up the ledger entries and the email summaries," he said, sliding a stack of pages toward me. His voice was flat, but there was an edge I hadn't heard before. "Make it look like the oversight happened in a draft version that never got circulated. Clean it so our counsel can present a clear timeline. This is above your pay grade, but I need it done." I put my hands on the papers and felt the throttle of my pulse. He was asking me to rewrite history. If I altered those documents, the trail I had been building would be erased. I knew he was desperate enough to try anything, but I had already learned his tactic: deflect, scapegoat, and move on. I had no intention of becoming his eraser. Outwardly, I nodded and accepted the files. I left his office with a calm I trained myself to wear like a coat. I carried a copy to my desk under the pretense of working on it. But as everyone else returned to their routines, I quietly scanned each sheet into my secure folder. I duplicated emails, saved metadata, and encrypted the files on a flash drive I kept tucked inside a book in my bag. If anyone ever tried to say the records had been changed, I would have the originals intact. He tried again the next day, more demanding. "Clara, make this clean. The lawyers don't need irrelevant clutter." He tapped the papers as if the touch would dissolve the truth. I sat across from him and pretended to type while I subtly copied attachments and saved server timestamps. When he left, I took the revised pages he expected and added them to the fake set, making sure the versions he would present matched the narrative he wanted. At the same time, I kept the authentic versions safe where no one would think to look. While Lawrence unraveled in one part of the building, I started to seek allies in another. Henry Talbot had been on the board for nearly 20 years. He didn't speak much in public, but people listened when he did. He had a way of watching a man and seeing the list of lies behind the smile. I had noticed the little things. The way he raised his eyebrow when Lawrence evaded a question, the way he always asked for original documents instead of summaries. He was cautious, and caution was the kind of weakness Lawrence mistook for loyalty. I found a reason to cross his path. In the coffee area one afternoon, I asked his opinion on a scheduling conflict that sounded innocuous. He looked up at me, measured my face for a long beat, then folded the paper I handed him and slipped it into his coat. "Keep your head down and keep your records," he said quietly. "People think titles give immunity. They don't." His voice held no condescension, only a shared understanding. That small exchange changed everything. Henry began asking for direct access to original files under the guise of oversight. He started to question Lawrence's version of events in board sessions, not bluntly, but in ways that made Lawrence stumble. I fed Henry the right pieces, carefully, only what he needed to push the right buttons. We moved with the rhythm of people who had learned the price of being loud, subtlety. Every time Lawrence demanded a rewritten sheet, I complied on the surface while protecting the truth beneath. His pressure grew, but so did my readiness. The cracks in his story widened, and I could feel, in the quiet evenings when I locked up the office and walked past his darkened suite, that the moment to reveal what I had collected was drawing near. The boardroom was thick with tension that morning. The lawsuit with Caldwell Industries had reached the stage where excuses weren't enough, and the directors wanted a clean explanation. Lawrence walked in with his usual confidence, carrying a binder that I knew was full of the cleaned-up documents he had ordered me to prepare. He looked polished, but underneath his practiced smile, I could see the nervous flicker in his eyes. He launched into his presentation with the kind of bravado that had once charmed clients. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we are dealing with here is not a leadership failure, but a clerical oversight," he began, flipping open his binder. "The secretary responsible for reviewing these drafts failed to catch the discrepancy before it reached my desk. Unfortunately, it slipped through, but we have since corrected the files to reflect the truth." He slid copies of the rewritten documents across the table. I recognized them instantly, the versions he had forced me to alter, stripped of context and bent to fit his story. For a few moments, the board studied them in silence. Lawrence mistook their quiet for agreement and pressed on, his voice growing louder, his words smoother. I sat in my chair, hands folded, saying nothing. He was digging deeper, every word tightening the rope around his own neck. He described how he had taken swift action, how he had been misled by incomplete clerical work, and how he had personally overseen the revisions. His eyes darted toward me a few times, daring me to object, but I kept my face calm, unreadable. Then Henry Talbot spoke. "Lawrence," he said, his tone slow, deliberate, "if these are the corrected files, then we'll need to see the originals for our records. It's standard procedure. Surely you've kept them." Lawrence froze for a second too long. He recovered quickly, but the pause was enough. "The originals were overwritten in the process of correction," he replied smoothly. "There's no need for confusion with outdated drafts." That was my moment. I reached into the folder I had carried in and slid a packet across the table. My voice was steady when I spoke. "With respect, Mr. Talbot, I kept the originals. Every email, every memo, and every signed draft. Here are the time-stamped records showing when the error was first noticed and when I sent a warning." The room went still. The directors leaned forward as Talbot opened the folder, scanning the documents with sharp eyes. There were my highlighted notes, my email to Lawrence with the subject line urgent, Caldwell contract discrepancy, and his dismissive reply, time-stamped and undeniable. No one spoke for a long moment. Lawrence's face drained of color. He tried to laugh, to brush it off as a misunderstanding, but the silence in that room weighed more than any words he could muster. The directors weren't looking at me anymore. They were all staring at him. The story he had tried to pin on me collapsed in an instant. His betrayal had spun full circle, and now he was the one cornered. He had set out to bury me, but all he had done was dig the hole deep enough to bury himself. The boardroom that day felt colder than usual. After my evidence was laid out, the silence that followed was heavy, and Lawrence tried to fill it with excuses. He stammered about confusion, about drafts and clerical errors, about how my files must have been outdated. But his voice no longer carried the smooth confidence that once commanded every room. The board wasn't buying it. Henry Talbot cleared his throat. "This firm cannot afford leadership that misrepresents facts to its own people and its clients. What you've shown us today, Lawrence, is not only negligence, it is dishonesty." His words cut clean, and the others around the table nodded, some slowly, some with sharp conviction. For the first time, Lawrence looked small. He opened his mouth to argue, but another director interrupted him. "Caldwell has already refused to continue negotiations until you're no longer in the room," she said. "They don't trust you, and frankly, neither do we." The vote wasn't long. It didn't need to be. One by one, they made it clear. His time as CEO was over. They demanded his resignation immediately, before the firm lost any more credibility. Lawrence's face reddened as he slammed his binder shut, the sound echoing across the glass walls. He looked around the table, searching for anyone to defend him, but all he found were steady stares. When his eyes landed on me, they burned with fury. For a moment, it felt as though he might say something, might try to drag me down one last time. But he didn't. He knew there was nothing left to throw. He stood up so fast his chair scraped across the floor and stormed toward the door. As he pulled it open, he turned back just long enough to glare at me, a silent promise of the hatred he carried. Then he left, his footsteps fading down the hall. The room exhaled once he was gone. A few directors began shuffling papers. Others whispered to each other. No one looked at me right away, though I felt the shift. I was no longer invisible. The secretary they had barely noticed had just brought down their CEO. I should have felt satisfied, but sitting there, I realized humiliation wasn't enough. Watching him lose his position was powerful, yes, but it didn't erase the months of disrespect, the way he had mocked me in front of others, or the moment he had tried to pin his disaster on me. His downfall had only just begun, and part of me wanted to make sure it didn't end with a simple resignation. As the meeting adjourned, Henry caught my eye. He gave me the slightest nod, an acknowledgement that what I had done had changed everything. I gathered my papers, sliding them back into my folder, and walked out of that boardroom with a steady pace. Lawrence was gone, his reputation already in ruins, but for me, the work wasn't finished. Justice had to be more than a single victory. I wanted him to understand, in the deepest way possible, what it meant to underestimate me. The weeks after Lawrence's resignation were chaotic. Caldwell's lawyers still hovered, the firm's reputation was shaky, and morale inside the office was thin. But without Lawrence's shadow over everything, there was room for something new to take root. Henry Talbot stepped in as acting chair of the board, and to my surprise, he asked for my help almost immediately. At first, I thought he just wanted my memory of the files, the dates, the details. But soon it became clear that he valued more than that. He noticed how much I already knew about the daily flow of the company. Where things were weak, which clients were nervous, which managers were coasting on titles instead of results. He asked for my input on stabilizing things. And for the first time in years, someone actually listened. The more I worked alongside the board, the more they leaned on me. I drafted recovery plans, smoothed communication with Caldwell's team, and cut through the clutter that others had left to rot. Meetings that used to leave me invisible now ended with my notes becoming the roadmap everyone followed. I didn't need to raise my voice or force anyone to see me. The facts did it for me. Then one morning, Henry called me into his office. He didn't draw it out. He simply handed me a letter and said, "You've already been doing this work. It's time you had the title." The letter named me Director of Operations. I held it in my hands, the weight of it sinking in. Around me, people who had once smirked at my suggestions, who had treated me as background, now came to me for direction. I wasn't a secretary anymore, not in title and not in their eyes. I had bypassed every one of the executives who had written me off, and they knew it. While my world shifted upward, Lawrence's crumbled downward. Word spread quickly in our industry, and no one wanted to touch him. Caldwell refused to deal with him again, and other firms quietly blacklisted him. The man who once walked through polished lobbies with his chin high now couldn't even get a consulting contract. I heard bits and pieces. How he tried to start his own practice but failed, how he sold his penthouse and moved into a smaller place, how creditors circled closer every month. Some people pitied him, but I didn't. I remembered too well the way he had laughed at me, the way he had tried to crush me under his arrogance. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the office glass, papers in my hands, giving instructions that people followed without question. I'd think about the words he had thrown at me, just a secretary, and the corner of my mouth would curve into a quiet smile. He had underestimated me, and it cost him everything. I didn't need to ruin him further. The truth had already done that. My revenge was simple, steady, and complete. I had risen while he fell, and I wasn't invisible anymore. There were quiet moments, long after the dust had settled, when I let myself think back on how everything had unfolded. The firm was steady again, the panic had passed, and I no longer carried the fear of being dismissed or silenced. Yet in those moments, I couldn't help but replay the look on Lawrence's face the day he called me, just a secretary. That single moment of arrogance had shaped everything that followed. It struck me how quickly pride can blind even the most powerful. Lawrence wasn't stupid. He had built the company from the ground up, but he believed too much in his own image. He thought charm could cover mistakes, that rank made him untouchable, and that people beneath him were too small to matter. That blindness had been his undoing, and in the end, he tripped over the truth he refused to see. I remembered the sting of humiliation, standing in front of my coworkers as he mocked me for speaking up. The laughter that followed me out of the room still echoed in my mind, though now it had lost its sharp edge. Back then, it cut deep. It made me feel invisible, insignificant, powerless. But when the truth finally came out, When those same people sat in silence as I laid the evidence on the table, the memory shifted. The same room that had once been filled with ridicule became the place where my voice finally mattered. It was sweet, but not in the way I had expected. It wasn't about watching Lawrence fall, though that was satisfying. It was about finally being heard, about the truth standing on its own without me needing to shout. That was the part that stayed with me. The justice wasn't loud or messy. It was calm, steady, undeniable. I didn't walk around the office bragging about what happened. There was no need. People remembered on their own. The same managers who once brushed past me now listened carefully when I spoke. Meetings that used to move on without my input now paused to hear my perspective. Respect had become something automatic, something demanded by the way I carried myself, not asked for. I still worked hard. That part never changed. The late nights, the detailed notes, the quiet preparation. I kept those habits because they were mine, not because anyone told me to. But now the work didn't feel like an invisible burden. It felt like contribution, like I was finally part of the voice that shaped the company's future instead of being a shadow behind it. Sometimes I would walk past the glass doors of the boardroom, see my reflection, and think about the path from where I had started to where I stood now. The betrayal, the anger, the humiliation, they had all been fuel. And in the end, they had carried me to a place where I no longer had to prove myself to anyone. My voice was heard, my place was solid, and respect was no longer something I hoped for. It was something I owned. In the end, I understood something I hadn't seen clearly before. I didn't need to scream, argue, or force anyone to see my worth. The power had never been in shouting over others. It had been in holding on to the truth and waiting for the right moment to let it speak for itself. Patience, truth, and timing were stronger than anger ever could be. Lawrence thought he could bury me with his arrogance. He believed his title made him untouchable and my voice insignificant. But it was the small, careful steps, the notes I kept, the warnings I sent, the quiet way I watched, that turned everything against him. His downfall wasn't delivered by revenge in the loud sense of the word. It was delivered by his own refusal to listen, exposed at the exact moment he least expected it. The lesson stayed with me long after he was gone. In any room, in any meeting, I remembered how quickly people will dismiss the ones they think are too small to matter. But I also remembered how easily those same people can be proven wrong. Never underestimate the quiet ones. The person you push aside today may be the same one who holds the evidence, the knowledge, or the strength to undo you tomorrow. That thought never left me. It reminded me to keep steady, to let my work and my voice carry weight without needing validation from those who doubted me. Respect earned in silence lasts longer than respect demanded through noise. One morning, not long after my promotion, I walked into the boardroom with a folder under my arm. The directors were already seated, waiting for the meeting to begin. A year ago, I would have slipped in quietly, taken my notes, and stayed in the background. Now, I took my place at the table, set my papers down, and met their eyes without hesitation. No one saw me as invisible anymore. No one thought of me as just a secretary. I wasn't defined by the dismissal of one man's arrogance. I was defined by the fact that I had stood my ground, trusted myself, and let the truth reveal itself in time. And as I sat there, ready to lead the discussion, I knew the real victory wasn't in watching Lawrence fall. The real victory was in knowing I had risen without compromising who I was.